Okay, if you've never read Henry VI, let me offer you a summary. This poor infant, like literal infant, becomes king upon his father's death. Then he spends the next 30-something years of his life being manipulated by everyone he knows. He has to fight to keep his crown because his claim to the throne is kind of sketchy. Everybody in the play changes sides like 4 billion times. And all of this fighting and all of this conflict and all of this civil war only happens so that he ends up murdered in the end. So I had never read Henry VI, none of the parts. I'd never read part 1, part 2, part 3. All this was very new to me. Like I had mentioned in previous videos, histories were not really my strong suit. They're not my favorite. They're not really that enjoyable to me for the most part. So I was really pleasantly surprised by Henry VI. Overall, I'd say I enjoyed it 70% of the time, which I think is pretty good for me in histories. I liked part 1 the most, and I liked part 2 the least. And then part 3 was probably somewhere in between there. So for the Shakespeare 2020 project, Henry VI part 1 was supposed to be read January 10th through the 16th. Part 2, January 18th through the 25th. And part 3, January 27th through February 2nd. It is now February 9th, and I've just finished part 3. So I'm actually one whole play behind because Comedy of Errors was supposed to be read February 4th through the 8th. Yikes. But looking at the schedule, we have for the next 4 plays, Comedy of Errors, Taming of the Shrew, Titus Andronicus, and Romeo and Juliet. I love all 4 of those plays. I've read them all before. I've read Comedy of Errors once, Taming of the Shrew I think 3 times, Titus Andronicus once, and Romeo and Juliet I've probably read like 30 times. And we'll get to why I've read that one so much in that video. But essentially they all have to be read by March 2nd. So I've still got like 3.5 weeks. So I think I can catch up. I think I'm just gonna need to keep in mind that the plays that I'm not familiar with are going to take me a lot longer, as will the plays that I don't particularly enjoy as much. So like I said in my previous video, I really should be reading like about an act a day, and I'm not really doing that. I'm having a hard time keeping up with that kind of schedule, just with like my full-time job and my part-time job, and then I'm in a book club, and then I don't know, I want to watch TV. So hopefully I'll be able to keep up with it a little bit better in the future. If not, at least make some conscious effort. I feel like overall being 1 week behind is not too bad. So let's talk about part 1. I read the online Folger digital text because I didn't have the book. And as I said in my first video, I'm not gonna go out and buy like all of these if I don't have them. So I just read the online version, which was a little bit of a pain at points just with the lack of footnotes. It was just so challenging. One thing I did love is there's a lot of clarity about who's entering and who's exiting and who's talking to who. Like if one character is particularly addressing another character, they point that out instead of you having to guess like, okay, is this person talking to this person or whatever, which is really nice. I find, and this is not the fault of this version, but the thing I don't really like about histories is, well, in terms of reading them, is I find them really, really challenging to visualize. Like for example, this is Act 1, Scene 2. Charles the Dauphin he's fighting. He says, sound, alarm, we will rush on them. Now for the honor of the forlorn French, him I forgive my death, that killeth me when he sees me go back 1 foot or fly. Stage direction says, they exit, hear alarm, they are beaten back by the English with great loss. I feel like the histories are so much more exciting to watch because you get all of the action, and like here it's like they're beaten back by the English with great loss. And like on the stage it's gonna look amazing. Reading it, it's like, cool. Can I have like some more detail? So I think that's kind of like the weakness of not the text itself, but just the way it is when you read Shakespeare as opposed to watching it. You know, same thing like with tone, like you're having to decide, okay, what tone of voice are these people using? Like I read, this is sound the alarm, but it was probably more like, sound the alarm, you know? So let's talk part one. Immediately, I was drawn in. I think it's a great opening. Listen to this, the opening lines here. Hung be the heavens with black, yield day to night. Comets, importing change of times and states, brandish your crystal tresses in the sky, and with them scourge the bad revolting stars that have consented unto Henry's death. King Henry V, too famous to live long, England never lost a king of so much worth. Gloucester responds, England never had a king until his time. Virtue had he, deserving to command. His brandished sword did blind men with his beams, his arms spread wider than a dragon's wings, his sparkling eyes replete with wrathful fire, more dazzled and drove back his enemies than midday sun fierce bent against their faces. What should I say? His deeds exceed all speech. He ne'er lifted up his hand, but conquered. And it goes on and on as other characters chime in with their thoughts. Being familiar with Henry V really helped draw me in immediately, in addition to just how beautiful the language is right off the bat. I really, really appreciated that. In fact, there are several spots where I just thought, oh, wow, this is killer. The language is just gorgeous in this place. Let me point out a couple of them to you. I pulled two particular ones to share. So the first one that I wanted to share is the opening of Act 1, Scene 2. It's from the Dauphin, Charles. Listen, just freaking listen to these beautiful, just 8 lines. Mars his true moving, even as in the heavens, so in the earth to this day is not known. Late did he shine upon English side, now we are victors, upon us he smiles. What towns of any moment but we have? At pleasure here we lie, near Orleans. Other whiles, the famished English, like pale ghosts, faintly besiege us 1 hour in a month. Just the language, y'all. Just sometimes the poetry, like even that, it's not like this particularly monumental or significant speech. It doesn't even, in the grand scheme of life, matter too much in this play. But just, the language, so wonderful. Okay, the second example, it's part 1, Act 2, Scene 5. It's Edmund Mortimer talking. He is in prison. He's old. He thinks he's going to die. This is what he says. Kind keepers of my weak decaying age, let dying Mortimer here rest himself. Even like a man new haled from the rack, so fare my limbs with long imprisonment. And these grey locks, the profusance of death, Nestor-like aged in an age of care, argue the end of Edmund Mortimer, these eyes like lamps whose wasting oil is spent, wax dim as drawing to their exigent, weak shoulders overborne with burdening grief, and pithless arms like to a withered vine that droops his sapless branches to the ground. Yet are these feet whose strengthless stay is numb, unable to support this lump of clay, swift-winged with desires to get a grave, as witting I no other comfort have. But tell me, keeper, will my nephew come? Just, that's it. Like, just so good. I'm just so happy. So basically, overall thoughts on part 1 is that it's pretty much a hot mess of just people vying for power, and everybody trying to manipulate Henry, really, because he's a child and they have all the control, and because you can't trust a child to make decisions. But just even looking at it, like the men, the ones who are supposed to be the adults in here, are really not the adults. Like, listen to this line. So, like, this is Winchester and Gloucester speaking, and Winchester says, Rome, like the city, Rome, shall remedy this, and Gloucester says, Rome thither then, as in Roam. Like, they just calm down. Like, they're just so petty with each other, and like all the adults are just like annoying. And it's like this in part 2 and 3 too. Even as Henry becomes an adult, everyone around him is just like fucking annoying and don't listen to him or like care about him at all, and are just, there's so much infighting and bickering, and you're looking at him who's like a child and you're like, wow, he's literally the most put together person in this play right now. At least that's how I felt. So kind of as I was reading part 1, I thought, I really hope that Henry VI grows up and kind of whips them all into shape and becomes this great and awesome king. That did not happen, unfortunately. He ends up kind of being a little bit lame, not gonna lie. So, let's talk part 2. Poor Henry is still way too young and stupid to realize that, like, literally everyone's manipulating him. Even his wife, who's cheating on him with the enemy and trying to, like, get her lover to become, have more power or whatever. It's a ripoff for him, really. Even, like, Gloucester, who I feel like is a really great guy, even with him, it's like Henry asks for his advice and he gives it, and then Henry just does what he suggests, which isn't necessarily bad because Gloucester's a pretty cool guy, but still, and then ultimately, like, everyone convinces Henry to get rid of Gloucester. They're like, oh, like, because Gloucester's wife was a huge D-bag, and she decided that she was gonna, like, hire some, like, sorcerers to make sure that her husband gained power, and she was caught because the witches were also working for these other guys. This is a whole thing. Anyways, so because of that, everyone's like, oh, Gloucester's in on it, and convinces Henry to kind of, like, get rid of him, like, basically, oh, I don't need you anymore. And it's like, dude, that's the only guy you can trust. It's, like, the worst. So Gloucester responds with this great line. This is Act 3, Scene 1. He says, these days are dangerous. Virtue is choked with foul ambition. The wolves are gnarling. Who shall gnaw the first? Good Henry, thy decay I fear. Like, just the whole time I'm like, Gloucester, my buddy. Like, he rebukes his wife and all that stuff, but still. Actually, that's a great part that I would love to talk about next, is the part with his wife. His wife kind of proves, first of all, that women can be just as petty as men in this. Like, her whole fight with Queen Margaret, like, where Margaret accidentally hits her. That's a whole thing. But there's this great part. It's at the beginning of not at the beginning of Act 2. It's Act 2, Scene 4. And it's when she's, like, being brought before the people and, being made to stand for her crimes. And she sees Gloucester, her husband. And, even though she's kind of sucks because she, did something that was, essentially wrong, Shakespeare makes you feel for her. And I think he does this because we like Gloucester, and he loves her still. So she has this beautiful, beautiful monologue. She says, Gloucester says, be patient, gentle Nell, forget this grief. First of all, using that nickname just gets to you. Then she says, ah, Gloucester, teach me to forget myself. For whilst I think I am thy married wife, and thou a prince, protector of this land, methinks I should not thus be led along, mailed up in shame, with papers on my back, and followed with a rabble that rejoiced to see my tears and heap my deep fat groans. The ruthless flint doth cut my tender feet, and when I start, the envious people laugh, and bid me be advised how I tread. Ah, Humphrey, can I bear this shameful yoke? Trowest thou that ere I'll look upon the world, or count them happy that enjoys the sun? No, dark shall be my light, and night my day. To think upon my pomp shall be my hell. Sometimes I'll say I'm Duke Humphrey's wife, and he a prince or ruler of the land. Yet so he ruled, and such a prince he was, as he stood by, whilst I, his forlorn duchess, was made a wonder and a pointing stock to every idle rascal follower. But be thou mild, and blush not at my shame, nor stir at nothing till the axe of death hang over thee, as surely it shortly will. For Suffolk, that he can do all in all, with her that hateth thee and hates us all, and York and impious Beaufort, that false priest, have all limed bushes to betray thy wings, and fly thou how thou canst, they'll tangle thee. But fear not thou until thy foot be snared, nor never seek prevention of thy foes. I just feel like she sounds remorseful. She regrets it, and she asks Gloucester to flee, to keep himself safe. It's like her last wish is about him. And it kind of makes you think that the bad that she did was really about her loving him instead of about her hating Henry. And I think that whole monologue basically makes you feel like she's a decent person. Which I think is really brilliant, because I think that's very true to life. Shakespeare takes these characters, you're like, ugh, but yet they have redeeming qualities. I mean, think about people you know in your own life, where maybe they annoy you, or you know they're not a good person, yet they do something and you're like, oh, well, okay, I kind of see why other people like them. You know, we see this in everyday life, where you're conflicted about this dichotomy in people. Which is a very real thing. I mean, everyone has that good and that evil. Another thing I thought a lot about in part 2 was all of Act 4, which is the Jack Cade rebellion. And Jack Cade was this guy who claimed that he deserved the throne, but it was really just kind of like a scam. He, led this rebellion of these people, and in real life, essentially, they were frustrated with the state of England, which is fair because there's all this infighting, there's all this civil war, nobody really knows who's supposed to be king, blah, 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 blah. And so he gathers up this group of these miscreants, they're not soldiers, they're just everyday people, and he leads this rebellion into London. And this play makes it out like he was this total idiot, he keeps killing people off for dumb things like speaking Latin or being able to write, and he's like, oh, down with anybody educated, and they portray him as this whole terrible traitor. And honestly, thinking about it kind of objectively, it's he probably was pretty valid in his anger. The government was kind of effed up at the time. I could totally see why he would want to rebel. I mean, ultimately his rebellion didn't work out, because the second he and his merry men get into London, they start focusing on looting instead of their goal. So it sort of fell apart very quickly, and he was caught and killed and blah 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 blah. But I sort of felt for him. When I learned the true story, I was like, well, that kind of makes sense. I mean, another thing I was thinking about in part 2 is how very Shakespearean it is. You've got the witches, you've got the pirates, and I was like, only Shakespeare could use these devices a million times and no one would care. I mean, witches, sure, because people believe they were actually real and had real power then, but pirates, were these a real problem in Shakespeare's time? Were people actually encountering pirates? Were they killed by pirates a lot? What's up with all the pirates? Hamlet, what else has pirates besides this? There's another one or two that have pirates. Or shipwrecks. Okay, I guess that kind of makes sense to me. Shipwrecks I could see being a real thing. But pirates? Were there like just a shit ton of pirates at the time? Was it common for people to be killed by pirates? I want to know why. Why so many pirates?
Also, as I was reading this, I was like trying to keep up with like who's on what side and, you know, who's friends with who and who is who. Kind of reminded me of the Trump impeachment trial. Felt like the entire time that was going on, even as someone who's like relatively politically informed, I had a really hard time like remembering like who was who and why they mattered and whose team they were on. It was like, you know, 30 people whose backstory you had to keep up with, and I kind of feel like that way reading Henry VI. It's like, okay, here are your 500 characters, and they all are important, and you gotta know who's who, and you have to understand whose side they're on, or even just like the differences between like why York and Lancaster felt like they had claim to the throne. Like that was a lot. Like there's literally just massive monologues of why certain people should have claim to the throne or why they shouldn't. And it all has to do with like who married who, or like whose father was who, or whose great-great-grandfather was who, and like the whole thing is very complicated. Honestly, kind of a pain. I think that's another reason why I don't really like histories. I'm like, ugh, these ones with the kings and like, you know, it becomes a lot. It's too much for me. It's like, this is why I don't like Game of Thrones. There's too much to keep up with. And like, maybe that's lazy, but I don't care. I like it simple, which is why I'm really excited about the next book, Comedy of Errors, because there's like 4 characters and there's not a lot to keep up with. Part 3. What I really thought about a lot in part 3 was about Henry and his character, now that he's an adult. The thing that I feel like kept coming up when I was reading is his desire to kind of be this peacekeeper. And I think a lot of that has to do with his faith. He speaks often of his religion. He prays often. He asks for forgiveness often. He's got a lot of desire to make people be at peace. He doesn't really like all the war and the conflict, which I get. I myself am a pacifist. But I felt like it kind of makes him a bad leader, which made me sort of question my own political beliefs, because I'm very like anti-war, but I'm also like reading this and I'm annoyed because I'm like, Henry, like do something. Like he's just like, oh, everybody get along, and I'm like, dude. I felt like in part 2, there's a spot in Act 4 where Margaret's all sad over Suffolk because, you know, like they were having an affair or whatever. And she's like depressed about it. And he looks at her and he says, I would have never believed you to ever be so sad about me dying as you are about Suffolk dying. And it's just this like, bam, like he gets it. And I thought that we were gonna see this kind of maturity and this strength come out of him. And it just never happens. Like I kept thinking like that's where it's gonna come in part 3. And I felt like he actually got kind of weaker in part 3. Like it opens and, you know, very quickly he and York get into this conversation and York's all like, oh, I have claim to the throne, blah, blah, blah. And Henry straight up, I shit you not, this is real life, and like, I guess I should say that maybe being the Shakespeare buff I am, I should know more about England and its history and understand everything that happened, but I did not. This boy straight up says to York, oh, you and or your descendants can have the throne upon my death if you promise peace during my reign. Like, what the hell? That's a really shitty deal, you know? Mainly for Henry, and also for his son, who is rightfully pretty freaking pissed. And Margaret is too. And she hits him with this line. She says that he prefers his life over honor. And I was like, oh damn. Because really, he does. Like, he basically throws away his son's birthright for peace, but it seems almost like he just wants peace while he's alive. Like he doesn't give a shit about what happens after his death. It's kind of the way I felt about it. And then immediately after I was like, yeah, there's no way this is gonna work. Like,
nobody's cool with this deal, which of course happens. So like Margaret is like, oh, this is the worst thing ever, which to be fair, she probably is still kind of upset about Suffolk's death and like doesn't really like Henry anyways. So she and Prince Edward decided they're gonna like go to battle, and I really don't like Margaret. Like, I feel like the whole time she's kind of mean to Henry. And by kind of mean, I mean really mean. Like, she's never really that good to him. She plots against him. Even in part 3, she seems more on his side, but it really seems like it's for herself and for Prince Edward than it is for Henry. Like, she doesn't really seem like she loves him. And she's just, like, a really brutal person. Like, when she kills York, it's, like, unnecessarily mean. Like, she taunts him, she makes him wipe his face with this handkerchief soaked in his own son's blood after, you know, they killed his son. They put a paper crown on his head and, like, taunt him for thinking that he's king. I mean, it's really cruel. And I was just like, ugh, you know? And, like, then, like, shortly after that, and this is Act 2, Scene 2, there's this part where they're all kind of like talking and arguing, and Henry says, I prithee, give no limits to my tongue. I am the king and privileged to speak. Then literally Margaret and Prince Edward and like everybody else ignores him, and he doesn't talk again for the rest of the scene. In fact, he doesn't talk again for like 3 more scenes. Like, she's not nice. And also, but this goes back to the whole like everybody like not giving a shit about Henry. Like, they literally don't care about him. Like, his power is so meaningless. The only reason all of these people want him to be king is because they either don't like York, or they get something out of it, or somebody that they love, like Prince Edward, gets something out of it. Like, nobody really cares about Henry, other than Gloucester, who's of course dead. So it's like, great. And then he comes back, though. We'll say this is literally the best part. So he comes back with this awesome monologue, and this is Act 2, Scene 5. He's alone after like all this infighting and nobody caring about him, and like Margaret tells him that he's not wanted on the battlefield because she can win without him, and it's so sad. And he says, this battle fares like a morning's war, when dying clouds contend with glowing light. What time the shepherd, blowing of his nails, can neither call it perfect day or night. Now sways it this way like a mighty sea, forced by the tide to combat with the wind. Now sways it that way like the selfsame sea, forced to retire by fury of the wind. Sometimes the flood prevails, and then the wind. Now one the better, then another best, both tugging to be victors, breast to breast. Yet neither conqueror nor conquered. So is the equal poise of this fell war. Here on this molehill I will sit me down. To whom God will, there will be the victory. For Margaret my queen and Clifford too have chid me from the battle, swearing both thy prosper best of all when I am hence. Would I were dead if God's good will were sole, were so. For what is in this world but grief and woe? O God, methinks it were a happy life to be no better than a homely swain, to sit upon this hill as I do now, to carve out dials quaintly, point by point, therefore to see the minutes how they run, how many makes the hour full complete, how many hours brings about the day, how many days will finish up the year, how many years a mortal man may live. When this is known, then to divide the times. So many hours I must tend to my flock, so many hours I must take my rest, so many hours I must contemplate, so many hours I must sport myself, so many days my ewes have been with young, so many weeks ere the poor fools will eat, so many years ere I shall shear the fleece, so minutes, hours, days, months, and years passed over to the end they were created, would bring white hairs to a quiet grave. Ah, what a life were this, how sweet, how lovely. And he goes on and on, basically wishing that he were someone else. And God, it just kills me. Like, I feel for him. This is literally my favorite scene in probably all 3 parts. This is part 3, Act 2, Scene 5. And after he wishes all these things, this son comes in, dragging this body of someone he killed, and he looks at the person he killed, and it's his father. And he realizes him and his father were fighting on different battles, and he's very upset by this. And then Henry becomes upset. And then a father comes in, dragging the body of someone he killed, and he realizes it's his son. And it becomes very upset. And then Henry becomes very upset. And it's this whole thing where he realizes the horrors of war. And he says, "O piteous spectacle of bloody times, whilst lions war and battle for their dens, poor harmless lambs abide their enmity. Weep, wretched man, I'll aid thee tear for tear, and let our hearts and eyes, like civil war, be blind with tears and bleak, overcharged with grief." And it's, like, it kills me, and I want there to be peace for him. This whole time, like I said, like, his religious convictions make him want peace, and he doesn't get it, and it's so upsetting. Like, even at the end when he dies, it's like almost like he just gives up. Like, he's just like, fine, kill me then, you know, like, I feel bad for him having to become king at 9 months old and grow up with all this responsibility and nobody really caring about you as a person, and your thoughts and your opinions, and your own wife doesn't even love you. Like, what an awful life he had. It's just so sad, you know? I mean, like, literally, he's such a nice person. Like, when he's in prison, he straight up thanks his guard for making his time in prison great. And then his dying breath, like, as Richard kills him, literally, his dying breath, he asks God to forgive Richard. Like, he's a much better man than literally anyone in this play. For, like, or any woman in this play. Literally, for all 3 parts, like, other than Gloucester, he's, like, the nicest person. I mean, he's better than Gloucester still. Like, he's just all about, like, God and peace and, like, wanting people to be happy. And I don't know, I'm like on the one hand, I'm like, what the frick, chill with kindness. And on the other hand, I'm like, you're literally the nicest person. And I just feel bad for him. Like, he doesn't really get what he wants, you know? And, like, it sucks, because why does Edward get to rule? He's an idiot. Like, he's so dumb. Like, the whole thing with him marrying that random widow, and you're like, the hell? Like, he's not, like, Warwick, can't pronounce that name, says it. He says, you know, like, you don't have the type of personality to rule, man. Like, you make bad decisions, you know, you don't deserve this power, whatever. Yet he gets to be in power at the end. What the hell? You know? And clearly we know that that's not going to work out for him if you know anything about English history, but still, he shouldn't get to rule even for a brief period of time. So ultimately, final thoughts on this play, I feel really bad for Henry, and everyone else sucks. The end. See you next week for Comedy of Errors.